He risked freezing in the blizzard to help her, just like his father died trying to save others in a storm. But when a limousine pulled up, his face turned pale. Marcus Johnson stood at his bedroom window, watching the first snowflakes drift down from the gray December sky. His breath fogged the glass as he pressed his forehead against the cold surface. The radiator in the corner had gone silent hours ago, and the chill was already creeping through their third-floor apartment. "Marcus!" His mother's voice, followed by a deep cough, came from the kitchen. "Baby, you better not be thinking about going out there today." He pulled back from the window, his fingers lingering on the frost-touched glass. "I'm just looking, Mom." The lie felt heavy in his throat. They both knew he needed to sell more papers. The rent was due, and they were short again. Another cough echoed through their small apartment, making Marcus's stomach tighten. He grabbed his backpack, checking the fold-up umbrella inside. Not that it would help much in a snowstorm, but it was better than nothing. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cough medicine when he walked in. His mother stood at the counter, her work uniform hanging loose on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. "Mom, you need to rest." Marcus moved to her side, trying to take the cup from her hands. She pulled away, shaking her head. "I'm fine. Just a cold." "That's what you said yesterday. And the day before. We can't afford for me to be sick right now." She set the cup down harder than necessary, coffee sloshing over the rim. "The landlord's been by twice this week already." As if summoned by her words, heavy footsteps thundered up the building's main staircase. Marcus recognized the rhythm. Mr. Patterson, right on schedule for his third visit this week. The knock rattled their front door. "Mrs. Johnson, I know you're in there." Marcus's mother straightened her shoulders, tugging her robe tighter. She moved to open the door, but Marcus got there first. Mr. Patterson filled the doorframe, his bulk wrapped in a heavy winter coat that probably cost more than their monthly rent. His face was flushed from the stairs, making the veins in his neck stand out. "Where's your mother, boy?" "Right here, Mr. Patterson." She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Marcus. "Rent's 4 days late." He thrust a piece of paper toward her. "This is your final notice. I've got 3 families asking about this unit. You've got until the day after Christmas, then you're out." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists. "But that's only dash, Marcus." His mother's voice carried a warning. To Patterson, she said, "We'll have it. I get paid next week." "You said that last week." Patterson's eyes swept over their apartment, lingering on the silent radiator. "Heat's out again." "Huh? Maybe if you paid your rent on time, I could afford to fix it faster." Marcus watched his mother's shoulders stiffen. "We'll manage." "Yeah, well, manage somewhere else if you don't have the money by the 26th. Patterson turned, his boots heavy on the landing. "And tell your kid to stop lurking around my building trying to sell those papers. Makes the place look bad." The door slammed behind him, and Marcus's mother sagged against the wall. Another cough shook her frame, and this time she couldn't hide the way her hand came away from her mouth spotted with red. "Mom!" Marcus rushed to her side, guiding her to a kitchen chair. "It's nothing." She waved him off, but her voice was weaker. "Just bit my tongue." Marcus went to their bathroom, opening the medicine cabinet. Empty cold medicine bottles lined the shelf. He counted the money hidden behind them, $43.17, saved from his newspaper sales. Not nearly enough. Back in the kitchen, his mother had her head in her hands. "Maybe we should call your aunt in Georgia." "No." Marcus grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "I can sell more papers today. The storm's bringing people home early. They'll want news." "Marcus Johnson, don't you dare." His mother stood, swaying slightly. "Your father Dad died trying to help people in a storm." Marcus cut her off. "This is different. I'm just selling papers." The memory hit him anyway. His father's car, crushed against a guardrail 3 years ago. He'd stopped to help stranded motorists in a blizzard, just like he always did. The second car hadn't seen him in time. The storm's getting worse. His mother moved to the window, pointing at the thickening snow. "Please, baby, stay home." Marcus zipped up his coat, checking that the holes in the sleeves weren't too visible. 2 hours, Mom. I promise. People will be at the station trying to get home early. I can make at least $30. She wanted to argue. He could see it in the way her jaw clenched. But another cough rattled her chest, and they both knew they needed the money. 2 hours, she finally said. Then you come straight home. Understand? Yes. He hugged her quickly, pretending not to notice how warm her skin felt. I'll bring back medicine too. Marcus. Her voice stopped him at the door. Your father? He was a good man. But being good got him killed. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He took the stairs 2 at a time, pushing through the building's front door into the swirling snow. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his thin coat. The street was already dusted white, and the few people still out hurried past with their heads down. Marcus adjusted his backpack, feeling the weight of the newspapers inside. He turned toward the subway station, snow crunching under his worn sneakers. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes being good is all we've got, son. Marcus pulled his first paper from his bag, holding it up as a businessman hurried past. Extra! Extra! Major storm warning. Get your evening news. The snow fell harder, and Marcus squared his shoulders against the wind. 2 hours. He could do this. They needed this. He just had to stay warm. Stay focused. Stay safe. The ghost of his father's car flashed through his mind. Metal twisted against white snow, and Marcus forced it away. This was different. This was just selling papers. But as the storm clouds darkened overhead and the wind picked up speed, a shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The snow was falling faster now, clumping in Marcus's hair and melting down his neck. He'd sold 12 papers in the last hour, each dollar bill carefully folded in his pocket. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Last paper. Breaking news about the storm. His voice cracked against the wind. A woman hurried past, clutching her designer purse close. Marcus watched her disappear into the swirling white, another potential sale lost. The subway station entrance loomed ahead, normally busy at this hour. Today, the steps were already slick with ice, and only a few desperate commuters trudged up and down. Marcus positioned himself near the railing, holding a paper high. Sir, major storm warning. Only $2. A man in a business suit paused, snow collecting on his expensive overcoat. $2? For a newspaper? He scoffed, checking his watch. Highway robbery. Please, sir. The storm dash. Get a real job, kid. The man pushed past, disappearing into the station. Marcus lowered his arm, the paper wilting in his grip. His fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and his sneakers were soaked through. He checked his phone. Dead. The cold must have killed the battery. Only 5 more, he muttered, counting the remaining papers in his bag. Just 5 more. A gust of wind whipped down the street, sending trash cans rattling. Marcus grabbed the railing to steady himself, his worn gloves sliding on the icy metal. The street lights were coming on early, casting yellow circles in the growing darkness. An ambulance wailed in the distance, its siren muffled by the snow. Marcus's heart clenched. Another memory of his father threatened to surface. Sirens, red lights on white snow, his mother's screams, no. He shook his head hard. Focus. A city bus groaned to a stop nearby, its wipers fighting the accumulating snow. 3 people got off, hunched against the wind. Marcus straightened, raising his paper again. Evening news. Storm warning. 2 ignored him. The third, an elderly man, dug in his pocket and handed over 2 crumpled dollars. Stay warm, son. Thank you, sir. Marcus carefully tucked the paper into the man's coat pocket, protecting it from the snow. 4 more to go. The wind picked up again, stronger this time. Snow stung Marcus's face like tiny needles. He squinted through the whiteout, barely able to see across the street now. The few remaining people on the sidewalk had become dark shapes in the swirling white. His mother's words echoed in his head. Being good got him killed. Marcus stamped his feet, trying to get feeling back in his toes. Maybe he should head home. He had enough for some medicine at least. But the rent money. A sound cut through the wind, a sharp cry, followed by the clatter of something falling. Marcus turned, peering through the snow. 20 feet away, near the corner grocery store, a shape moved against the whiteness. He took a step closer, then stopped. The storm was getting dangerous. He should go home. He promised his mother. 2 hours was almost up. Another cry, weaker this time. Marcus squinted harder. The shape resolved into a person, an elderly woman, trying to pick up scattered grocery bags in the deepening snow. Her gray hair whipped around her face, and her hands trembled as she reached for a rolling can. Marcus's feet moved before his brain caught up. "Hmm? Let me help you." The woman looked up, startled. She was older than he'd first thought, her face lined with deep wrinkles. Her coat was expensive but too light for this weather, and she wore dress shoes completely wrong for the snow. "Oh!" She pulled back as Marcus approached. No, I'm fine. Just drop my things." Marcus stopped a few feet away, his hands raised. "Please, let me help. The storm's getting worse." She hesitated, one hand clutching her purse close. Marcus saw fear flash across her face, fear of him, a young black boy approaching her in a snowstorm. He'd seen that look before. "I'm just trying to help," he said softly, thinking of his father. "Like someone should have helped my dad." The woman blinked, snow catching in her eyelashes. "Your father?" Before Marcus could answer, another gust of wind nearly knocked her over. She stumbled, her grocery bag sliding further away. Marcus lunged forward, catching her arm. Her skin was ice-cold through her thin sleeve. "Oh dear." Her voice shook. Perhaps I could use a bit of help." Marcus quickly gathered her scattered groceries, stuffing them back into the paper bags. His frozen fingers fumbled with a box of tea, nearly dropping it. "I'm Mrs. Thompson," the woman said, watching him work. "Eleanor Thompson. I may have walked a bit further than I should have. I'm Marcus." He straightened, holding both bags. "Where do you live, Mrs. Thompson?" She pointed vaguely north, into the worsening storm. "Maple Heights. Near the park." Marcus's stomach dropped. Maple Heights was a wealthy neighborhood across town, at least a 30-minute walk in good weather. "In this storm? That's too far to walk," he said. "We need to get you a cab." Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "I tried. None stopping. Phone's not working either." She looked around, confused. "I thought I knew these streets, but in this snow." Marcus glanced downtown, where home and his mother waited. Then north, into the white void of the storm. His father's voice whispered in his memory. "Sometimes being good is all we've got, son." "I'll walk you home," he heard himself say. Mrs. Thompson started to protest, but her words were lost in another violent gust of wind. She stumbled again, and Marcus saw her lips were turning blue. "Please, Mrs. Thompson. You've got milk and frozen things. They'll spoil." He shifted the bags to one arm, offering her the other. "My mom always says it's better to accept help than freeze trying to be proper." A small laugh escaped her. "Your mother sounds wise." She paused, studying his face. "You're certain? It's quite a walk." Instead of answering, Marcus tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. Her fingers gripped his coat weakly. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and together they turned north into the storm. The wind howled around them, drowning out the city sounds. Snow erased their footprints almost as soon as they made them. Marcus thought of his mother waiting at home, probably sick with worry now. But he couldn't leave Mrs. Thompson out here. His father hadn't left those stranded motorists in their storm. Sometimes being good was all you had. The remaining newspapers in his bag grew heavier with each step, reminding him of the rent money they still needed. But as Mrs. Thompson leaned more heavily on his arm, her breath coming in short gasps, Marcus knew he'd made the only choice he could. They disappeared into the whiteout together, two shapes against the white void, while the storm raged on. "We should have turned left back there." Mrs. Thompson's voice barely carried over the wind. Her steps had grown slower, more uncertain. Marcus adjusted his grip on her arm, trying to shield her from another gust. The grocery bags knocked against his legs, the paper beginning to tear from the snow. "The park is straight ahead, Mrs. Thompson. We'll see it soon." She didn't respond, her head bowed against the storm. They'd been walking for 20 minutes, but the familiar streets had become an alien landscape of white. Even the streetlights were just dim glows in the swirling snow. "Tell me about your son," Marcus said, remembering how she'd mentioned him earlier. Anything to keep her talking, keep her moving. "James?" Her voice cracked. He lives in California now. Sunshine all year. Smart boy." She stumbled, and Marcus caught her weight. "Haven't seen him since Harold, my husband, passed last spring." Marcus felt her shiver violently. Her coat was soaked through now, and ice crystals clung to her hair. He needed to get her somewhere warm, fast. A dark shape loomed ahead, the corner pharmacy. Marcus steered them toward it, relief flooding his chest at the glow of lights inside. "Let's rest a minute," he said, pulling open the heavy door. Warm air hit them like a wall. "No, no." Mrs. Thompson tried to pull away. "I'm fine. Just need to get home. Please, Mrs. Thompson. Just 5 minutes to warm up." The pharmacist looked up from his counter, frowning. "We're closing soon. Storm warning." Marcus guided Mrs. Thompson to a bench near the door. Her skin was frighteningly pale, her lips still tinged blue. He set down the grocery bags and rubbed his hands together, trying to get feeling back in his fingers. "I'll get you some water." He dug in his pocket, pulling out his newspaper money. 1 bottle. They could afford 1 bottle. Mrs. Thompson caught his wrist. "Don't waste your money, dear. I'm just being silly, getting lost in my own neighborhood." Her words slurred slightly. Marcus's stomach clenched. He'd learned about hypothermia in school: confusion, slurred speech, blue lips. All bad signs. The pharmacist was watching them now, his frown deepening. "Everything okay over there?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said quickly. "Just helping Mrs. Thompson get home to Maple Heights." "Maple Heights?" The pharmacist came around his counter. "That's 2 miles north of here. You'll never make it in this storm." "We have to try." Marcus grabbed the grocery bags. "Come on, Mrs. Thompson. Just a little further." She stood unsteadily, swaying. The pharmacist stepped forward. "Look, I can call you a cab dash." "Already tried." Marcus cut him off. "None running. Phone networks are down too." "Then you need to stay put. Both of you. Storm's supposed to get worse." Marcus looked out the pharmacy windows. The snow was falling so thick now he could barely see the street. But staying here wasn't an option. The pharmacist would close soon, and Mrs. Thompson needed real warmth, not just a few minutes shelter. "We'll be okay," he said, more confidently than he felt. "The park's not far. Once we see it, Mrs. Thompson can guide us to her house." The pharmacist shook his head. "Your funeral, kid?" He walked back to his counter, already reaching for his keys. Marcus tucked Mrs. Thompson's hand back into his arm. "Ready?" She nodded, but her eyes were unfocused. "James? When did you get here?" Marcus's heart dropped. She was getting worse. "It's Marcus, Mrs. Thompson. Remember? I'm helping you with your groceries." "Marcus." She blinked hard. "Yes, of course. I'm sorry, dear." "The cold?" They pushed back out into the storm. The wind had picked up even more, driving the snow horizontally now. Marcus could barely keep his eyes open against it. They trudged forward, each step a battle. Mrs. Thompson's confusion seemed to come and go. Sometimes she'd give clear directions, past the old oak tree, dear, and other times she'd call him James again. A car crept past, its hazards flashing weakly in the white chaos. Marcus waved, trying to flag it down, but it kept going, tires spinning in the deepening snow. "Should see the park soon," he said, though he wasn't sure anymore. Everything looked the same in the whiteout. His legs ached from breaking trail through the snow, and he'd lost all feeling in his feet. Mrs. Thompson stumbled again, harder this time. "I need to rest." "No." Marcus caught her before she could sit. "No resting. Tell me about your house. What color is it?" "Blue." Her voice was faint. "Victorian. Harold always said it was too big for just us. But the garden in spring." She trailed off, her weight getting heavier on Marcus's arm. He grabbed her waist, holding her upright. "Stay with me, Mrs. Thompson. Tell me about the garden." No response. "Mrs. Thompson." Fear shot through him. "Mrs. Thompson." Her eyes fluttered. "Cold. So cold." Marcus looked around desperately, but there was nothing but white in every direction. They were lost. Completely lost. His father's face flashed through his mind. Not the accident, but before, teaching Marcus to read a compass. Nature's landmarks, son. Even in the worst storm, they're there if you know where to look. Marcus squinted through the snow. Trees. There had to be trees. The park had huge old oaks. If he could just... There. A massive shadow, darker than the surrounding white. An oak tree. "Mrs. Thompson." He shook her gently. "Is this your oak tree? The one we pass?" She raised her head slightly. "What?" Yes. Yes, that old thing. Turn right at the oak." Marcus wanted to cry with relief. They weren't lost. Not completely. But Mrs. Thompson's steps were getting weaker, and the grocery bags were disintegrating in his hands. His own strength was fading, legs shaking with cold and exhaustion. The wind screamed around them as they turned right at the oak. Somewhere ahead was Mrs. Thompson's house. It had to be, because if it wasn't, if he'd led them the wrong way. No, he couldn't think about that. Couldn't think about his father's accident, about his mother waiting at home, about the rent money still unpaid. Just one step at a time. Into the white void. Into the howling storm. Marcus's arms burned from supporting Mrs. Thompson's weight. The tattered grocery bag swung against his legs, paper disintegrating in the wet snow. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, or his toes, or his face. "Talk to me, Mrs. Thompson," he said through chattering teeth. "Which house is yours?" Her head lifted slightly. Ice crystals had formed in her gray hair, making it sparkle in the dim streetlight. "Blue. Victorian." Her words slurred together. "Big white porch. Stay awake." Marcus shook her gently. "Please stay awake." They passed another house, its windows glowing warmly. Marcus could see people inside, gathered around a Christmas tree. A kid about his age pressed his face against the window, watching them struggle past. Mrs. Thompson's feet dragged in the snow. "James always loved Christmas. Tell me about him," Marcus urged. His own legs trembled with each step. "Tell me about James. My boy." Her voice strengthened slightly. "So smart. Got that scholarship to Stanford. Engineering, like his father." She coughed, the sound weak and wet. "Haven't seen him since the funeral. Says it's too busy." Marcus adjusted his grip on her waist. The grocery bags were falling apart completely now. A can of soup rolled into the snow, disappearing instantly. He couldn't go back for it. "My dad died in a storm like this," he found himself saying. 3 years ago. He stopped to help some people whose car broke down. Mrs. Thompson's fingers tightened on his arm. You must miss him terribly." "Yeah." Marcus blinked hard, snow or tears freezing on his cheeks. "Mom says I'm too much like him. Always trying to help. She must worry. All the time." The wind cut off his words. When it died down, he continued, "But Dad always said being good was all we had sometimes. That helping people mattered more than being safe." Mrs. Thompson was quiet for so long Marcus thought she'd passed out again. Then she whispered, "My James, he used to be like that. Before Harold died. Before California." They turned a corner, the wind now at their backs. Through the whiteout, Marcus could make out larger houses set back from the street. Iron gates and brick walls loomed in the darkness. "Almost there," he said, though he had no idea if it was true. "Just a little further." Mrs. Thompson's steps faltered. Can't feel my legs." "I've got you." Marcus tightened his grip. "Tell me what James was like as a kid. Did he sell newspapers too?" A weak laugh escaped her. No. Harold wouldn't allow it. Said it was a proper." Her voice drifted. "But he wanted to. Used to beg to help the gardener. Harold hated that." Marcus saw a flash of blue through the snow, a huge house with white trim. His heart leaped. "Mrs. Thompson, is that it? The blue house?" She raised her head slowly. "What? No, that's the Hendersons. Her words were barely audible now. Three more houses down." Marcus's legs nearly gave out. 3 more houses. They could make it. They had to make it. A newspaper slipped from the remains of his backpack, pages scattering in the wind. His last chance at rent money, flying away into the storm. Marcus watched it go, too exhausted to care. "James used to make paper airplanes," Mrs. Thompson murmured. "Hundreds of them. Said he'd be an engineer, build real planes someday." Her head drooped against Marcus's shoulder. "Hey, no sleeping." Marcus shook her again. "Tell me about the planes. What kind did he make?" But Mrs. Thompson didn't respond. Her feet dragged harder in the snow, her whole body becoming dead weight against him. Mrs. Thompson. Fear gave him a burst of strength. He half carried, half dragged her forward. "Wake up. Please wake up." The wind howled around them, drowning out his voice. Snow plastered against his face, filling his mouth when he tried to shout. His own vision was starting to blur, exhaustion and cold seeping into his bones. Another house appeared through the storm, massive and blue, with white columns and a wraparound porch. Marcus squinted at the number above the door, barely visible in the swirling snow. "Mrs. Thompson." Is this it? Is this your house? Her head lifted just slightly. Home. The word was barely a breath. Finally home. Marcus stumbled up the icy steps, his legs shaking so badly he nearly fell. The grocery bags finally gave up, spilling their contents across the porch. He ignored them, propping Mrs. Thompson against a column while he searched for a doorbell. His numb fingers found the button. Someone had to be home. Please, let someone be home. The porch light flickered on, blinding him. Through the frosted glass of the front door, a shape moved. Help! Marcus's voice cracked. Please help. The door opened, spilling warm air and light onto the porch. A woman in a maid's uniform stood there, her eyes widening at the sight of them. Mrs. Thompson. She reached for the elderly woman, then shouted over her shoulder. Mr. Peters. Call 911. She's freezing. Marcus sagged against the railing as more people appeared, a man in a suit, another maid, someone who looked like a cook. They lifted Mrs. Thompson, carrying her inside. The boy, too, he heard Mrs. Thompson say weakly. Bring Marcus in. But darkness was creeping at the edges of his vision. The warmth from the open door made his frozen body scream in pain. He tried to take a step and his legs buckled. The last thing he saw was the man in the suit lunging forward to catch him as he fell. Then everything went black. The first thing Marcus felt was warmth. Real warmth, like summer sunshine on his skin. His eyes fluttered open to find himself wrapped in thick blankets, sinking into the softest couch he'd ever felt. He's awake. A woman's voice called out. The maid from earlier appeared in his vision, her uniform crisp and neat. How are you feeling, young man? Marcus tried to sit up. His whole body ached, and his fingers and toes tingled painfully as feeling returned. Mrs. Thompson, is she okay? Thanks to you. The man in the suit, Mr. Peters, stepped into view. The paramedic said she was in the early stages of hypothermia. If you hadn't gotten her home. He shook his head. Well, let's just say you probably saved her life. Marcus looked around the room. Everything was huge, high ceilings, fancy paintings, furniture that probably cost more than his mom's yearly salary. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with what looked like real crystal ornaments. What time is it? Marcus suddenly remembered his mother. I need to call home. Already taken care of. Mr. Peters handed him a steaming mug of hot chocolate. We reached your mother about an hour ago. She's been quite worried, but we explained everything. She wanted to come, but in this storm. Is she okay? She's been sick, and resting comfortably, a familiar voice called from across the room. Mrs. Thompson sat in a large armchair, wrapped in blankets. Her color was better, but she looked fragile in the soft lamplight. I spoke with her myself. Lovely woman, your mother. Marcus's hands shook as he took a sip of hot chocolate. Real chocolate, rich and sweet, not the powder stuff he and his mom bought when they could afford it. The storm's getting worse, Mr. Peters said, glancing out a nearby window. Roads are closed now. You'll have to stay until it's safe. Marcus nearly choked on his drink. But I need to get home. The rent's due, and Marcus. Mrs. Thompson's voice was gentle but firm. Look outside. He turned to the window. The snow was a solid white wall now, the wind howling like a wild animal. Even the street lights were just dim smudges in the chaos. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson called to the maid. Please bring us something to eat. The boy must be starving. Right away. Marcus wanted to protest, but his stomach growled loudly. How long had it been since lunch? Since breakfast? While we wait, Mrs. Thompson said, tell me about yourself, Marcus. Really tell me, not just what we babbled about in the storm. He stared into his hot chocolate. Not much to tell. Just me and Mom since Dad died. We get by, selling newspapers. And Mom worked, at the diner. But she's been sick. He trailed off, not wanting their pity. Sarah returned with a tray of sandwiches, real ones, with thick bread and what looked like fresh turkey. Marcus's mouth watered. Eat, Mrs. Thompson instructed. Then we'll talk more. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He tried to eat slowly, to be polite, but the sandwich disappeared in minutes. Sarah quietly placed another in front of him. Your mother said you're 13. Mrs. Thompson watched him eat. Same age James was when he started asking about jobs. Did he really want to be a paperboy? Marcus asked between bites. A sad smile crossed her face. Oh yes. But Harold, My husband, he had very specific ideas about what was proper for our son. She sighed. I sometimes wonder if that's why James stays away now. Too many rules, too many expectations. Marcus set down his empty plate. At least he's got a good job. Engineering? You said? Yes, very successful. Mrs. Thompson's voice grew distant. But success isn't everything. I see that now, watching you tonight. You risked your life to help a stranger, just because it was right. Like my dad did. The words slipped out before Marcus could stop them. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward in her chair. Tell me about him. And somehow, in that warm room with the storm raging outside, Marcus found himself talking. He told her about his father's job as a mechanic, how he'd never pass a broken-down car without stopping to help. About the night of the accident, the phone call, the funeral they could barely afford. Mom tried to hide how bad things were after, Marcus said quietly. But I knew. That's why I started selling papers. And tonight? Why were you out in the storm? Marcus stared at his hands. Rent's due. We're behind again. Landlords threatening to evict us right after Christmas. A look passed between Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Peters. Well, Mrs. Thompson said after a moment, it seems we both had angels watching over us tonight. You saved my life, Marcus. I just did what anyone would do. No. Her voice was sharp. What you did, what your father did, it's rare. Special. She paused, studying him. My James used to have that kindness, that instinct to help. Before Harold and I taught him that success was more important than being good. Marcus shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He could still change. It's not too late. Perhaps. Mrs. Thompson smiled sadly. But tonight isn't about James. It's about you, and your remarkable mother who raised such a fine young man. Mr. Peters cleared his throat. Should I? Yes, Peter. Please make the calls. Marcus looked between them, confused. Calls? To my company's HR department. To start. Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. I believe we have several openings that would suit your mother's skills. Much better pay than a diner, and full medical benefits, of course. Marcus's heart stopped. What? And naturally, I'll need a personal assistant once I've recovered. Someone to help with errands, keep me company. She waved her hand. We can discuss details tomorrow. For now, you should rest. Peter will show you to a guest room. Marcus's head spun. But you don't even know us. I know enough. Mrs. Thompson's voice softened. I know what kind of man your father was, by the son he raised. I know what kind of woman your mother is, by the way she spoke on the phone. And I know that sometimes life gives us second chances, if we're wise enough to take them. Tears pricked at Marcus's eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed. Come, Mr. Peters said gently. You need sleep. Things will be clearer in the morning. Marcus stood on shaky legs. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. For everything. No, Marcus. She smiled, and for a moment she looked younger, like the mother she must have been before rules and proper behavior took over. Thank you for reminding an old woman what really matters. The storm howled outside, but in here, wrapped in warmth and kindness, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since his father died. Hope. Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through tall windows. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The bed was too soft, the room too big, the silence too complete. Then he remembered. The storm, Mrs. Thompson, the rescue. A knock at the door made him jump. Come in, Sarah, the maid, poked her head in. Breakfast is ready downstairs. Mrs. Thompson asked if you'd join her. Marcus looked down at his clothes from yesterday, still wrinkled from the snow. I don't. Fresh clothes on the chair, Sarah said, gesturing to a neatly folded pile. Mrs. Thompson had them brought over this morning. The storm's cleared, but it's still cold. She disappeared before Marcus could respond. He touched the clothes, new jeans, a thick sweater, winter boots that looked waterproof. The tags were still on them. His face burned. He couldn't accept these. It was too much. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, fully charged now. 3 messages from his mom. Baby, are you okay? Mrs. Thompson called. Thank God you're safe. Coming to get you soon. Love you so much. Marcus changed quickly, his old clothes feeling rough and shabby in comparison to the new ones. Everything fit perfectly. He tried not to think about how they knew his size. Downstairs, The mansion looked different in daylight. Sunlight caught the crystal ornaments on the Christmas tree, sending rainbows dancing across the walls. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving everything sparkling white and clean. There he is. Mrs. Thompson sat at a massive dining table, looking much better than last night. Come, sit. We have much to discuss. Marcus slid into a chair, overwhelmed by the spread before him: eggs, bacon, pancakes, fresh fruit, juice in crystal glasses. His stomach growled loudly. Eat, Mrs. Thompson instructed. Then we'll talk business. Business? Marcus loaded his plate, trying to be neat about it. Millimeter. She sipped her tea. I spoke with your mother again this morning. Lovely woman. She's quite worried about you. You know. Marcus swallowed hard. I'm sorry I scared her. You saved my life. Mrs. Thompson set down her cup. But yes, perhaps next time call before playing hero in a blizzard. A car horn sounded outside. Marcus jumped up, nearly knocking over his juice. Through the window, he saw his mother getting out of a taxi, Mr. Peters already moving to help her. Mom! He ran to the front door, throwing it open. She looked terrible, pale and tired, dark circles under her eyes. But her arms were strong when they wrapped around him. Don't you ever, she whispered fiercely, ever do that to me again. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. He buried his face in her shoulder, breathing in her familiar scent. Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Thompson had appeared behind them. Please, come in from the cold. We have much to discuss. Marcus felt his mother stiffen. Mrs. Thompson, I can't thank you enough for taking care of my son. But we really should dash. Nonsense. Sarah, more tea please. And something for Mrs. Johnson's cough. Before Marcus knew it, they were all seated in the living room. Him, his mother, Mrs. Thompson, and Mr. Peters. Sarah brought tea and what looked like expensive cough medicine. Now then, Mrs. Thompson folded her hands in her lap. About that job offer. Marcus's mother shook her head. It's very kind, but it's not kindness, Mrs. Johnson. It's business. Mrs. Thompson's voice was firm. I own several companies in the city. One of them, Thompson Healthcare, needs an office manager. Someone organized, efficient, good with people. The previous manager spoke very highly of your work at the diner. Marcus stared. When had she had time to check references? The salary is competitive, of course. Full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance. And Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. We have an excellent heating system. Marcus's mother touched her chest, trying to hide a cough. I don't understand. Why? Because your son showed me something I'd forgotten. Mrs. Thompson looked at Marcus. That sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars. Kindness, courage, doing what's right even when it's hard. These are rare qualities. They should be rewarded. But I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Johnson. I'm offering an opportunity. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. The question is, will you take it? Marcus watched his mother's face. He saw the worry there, the pride warring with desperation. He thought of their cold apartment, the empty medicine bottles, the unpaid rent. Mom, he said softly. Dad always said being good was all we had. But maybe sometimes being good brings good things back. A tear slid down his mother's cheek. You sound just like him. Is that so bad? She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just her little boy but the person he was becoming. Then she turned to Mrs. Thompson. When do I start? The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and plans. Marcus half listened as Mr. Peters explained salary details and start dates. His mother's hand shook as she signed the contracts, but her signature was firm. Finally, it was time to go. Mrs. Thompson insisted her driver take them home. One more thing, she said as they stood to leave. She handed Marcus an envelope. Your newspaper money. Since the storm ruined your sales. Marcus opened it. Far more than he would have made selling papers. Mrs. Thompson, I can't dash. You can and you will. She squeezed his hand. Consider it a Christmas bonus. For exceptional service in extreme weather. The driver helped them into a sleek black car with heated seats. As they pulled away, Marcus saw Mrs. Thompson watching from her window. She raised her hand in farewell. She's something else, his mother said quietly. Marcus nodded, watching the mansion disappear behind them. She made me think of Dad. How he always said one good deed could change everything. His mother wrapped an arm around him. He'd be so proud of you, baby. So proud. They drove through streets transformed by snow, all the dirt and darkness covered in clean white. Like a fresh start, a new beginning. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the car, his mother's arm around him, the weight of the envelope in his pocket. Outside, the city sparkled in the morning sun. Sometimes being good really was all you had. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough. Marcus woke early on Christmas morning to the sound of voices in the kitchen. Not just his mother's cough, but actual conversation, and was that laughter? He sat up in bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The apartment felt different. Warm. Actually warm. Baby, come out here, his mother called. Someone's here to see you. Marcus pulled on his new sweater from Mrs. Thompson and stepped into the hallway. The heat hit him first, real heat pouring from the radiators. Then the smell, coffee, bacon, something sweet baking. He rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped dead. Mrs. Thompson sat at their small table, wearing a red wool coat and holding a coffee mug. Mr. Peters stood by the window, talking quietly with Marcus's mother, who looked better than she had in weeks. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her cough sounded looser, less painful. "Merry Christmas, Marcus," Mrs. Thompson said, smiling. "I hope we didn't wake you too early." "What? How?" Marcus looked around the kitchen. Everything was the same but different. The refrigerator hummed quietly, no longer making that grinding noise. The window above the sink had stopped letting in cold drafts. "The heat," he said. "It's fixed." "Oh, that." His mother tried to hide a smile. "Seems Mr. Patterson had a change of heart last night. Sent someone over first thing this morning to repair everything." Marcus looked at Mrs. Thompson, who was suddenly very interested in her coffee. "Funny thing," Mr. Peters said dryly. "Mrs. Thompson happens to own the company that owns this building. Among others, there's been a change in management, shall we say." Marcus's mouth fell open. "You own Dash. I own many things, dear." Mrs. Thompson set down her cup. "Sometimes I forget to pay attention to all of them. But that's changing now." A timer dinged, and Marcus's mother pulled a pan from the oven. "Cinnamon rolls," he realized. "Real ones, not the cheap kind from a can." Mrs. Thompson brought breakfast, his mother explained. "And some other things." Marcus noticed the presents then, wrapped boxes under their small artificial tree, more than they'd had in years. His face burned. "You didn't have to dash." "I didn't." Mrs. Thompson cut him off. "These are from your mother." Her new job came with a rather generous signing bonus. His mother's eyes were bright with tears. "I wanted to wait, but, well, it's Christmas." Marcus looked at the presents, then at his mother, then at Mrs. Thompson. "I don't understand. Why are you doing all this?" Mrs. Thompson's face grew serious. "Do you know what I thought about, lying awake last night? I thought about how many times I must have passed your building, driven through this neighborhood, never really seeing it. Never seeing the people here." She touched Marcus's hand. "Until one of them saved my life. Anyone would have Dash, no." Her voice was sharp. "That's what I kept telling myself all these years. That anyone would help, anyone would care, anyone would do the right thing. But they don't, Marcus. You did, just like your father did." A knock at the door made them all jump. Mr. Peters answered it before Marcus could move. "Ah," he said. "Right on schedule." More people filed in, workers carrying tools, clipboards, measuring tapes. They nodded respectfully to Mrs. Thompson before spreading through the apartment. "What's happening?" Marcus asked. "Just a few repairs." Mrs. Thompson waved her hand. "Nothing major. New windows, better insulation, updated appliances. Consider it a Christmas gift to all the tenants." "Long overdue? Really?" Marcus's mother started to protest, but Mrs. Thompson held up a hand. "I told you, this isn't charity. It's business." She smiled. "Good business means taking care of your investments. Both the buildings and the people in them." The workers moved efficiently, barely disrupting their Christmas morning. Soon the apartment filled with the sounds of quiet work, measuring, planning, discussing improvements in low voices. Marcus helped his mother serve cinnamon rolls to everyone. The workers tried to decline, but she insisted. "It's Christmas," she said simply. Mrs. Thompson watched it all, something soft in her expression. "You know," she said quietly to Marcus, "I used to love this holiday. Before Harold got sick, before James moved away. We'd have parties, donations to charities, all the proper things. She sighed. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it really meant. And now? Marcus asked. She gestured around the warm kitchen, at the workers accepting coffee and breakfast, at Marcus's mother laughing at something Mr. Peters said. Now I remember. It's not about the gifts or the parties. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. A worker approached with a clipboard. The estimates for the building-wide improvements. Mrs. Thompson glanced at the numbers and signed without hesitation. Do it all. Every unit. And the Thompson Foundation will match whatever you spend on energy efficiency upgrades. The worker blinked. Yes, that's very generous. No. Mrs. Thompson looked at Marcus. It's very necessary. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Workers came and went, making notes and plans. Mrs. Thompson held court at the kitchen table, signing papers and making calls. Marcus's mother moved through it all in a daze, touching the new windowsills, the sealed drafts, the humming radiators. Finally, Mrs. Thompson stood. Well, I should let you enjoy your Christmas properly. Peter. Mr. Peters helped her with her coat. At the door, she turned to Marcus. I meant to ask, would you be interested in a job? A real one, not selling papers in blizzards. Marcus glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. What kind of job? My gardener is getting too old for the heavy work. He could use an assistant after school, weekends. Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. Someone strong, reliable, someone who isn't afraid of a little bad weather. Marcus thought of James, begging to work in his mother's garden. Of his own father, always ready to help. Of choices, and chances, and change. Yes, he said, I'd like that. Good. She touched his cheek gently. Merry Christmas, Marcus. Thank you for my second chance. After she left, Marcus stood at the window, watching her car pull away. The street below was transformed, not just by snow now, but by possibility. By hope. His mother wrapped her arms around him from behind. You okay, baby? Yeah. He leaned back against her, just thinking about Dad. About what he always said. Being good is all we've got. Yeah. Marcus smiled. But maybe sometimes it gives us more than we expect. Outside, the sun turned Christmas morning snow into diamonds. Inside, their apartment hummed with warmth and promise. And somewhere between the two, a boy who'd lost his father found his father's truth. That one act of kindness could change everything. Sometimes being good really was all you had. But sometimes, it was everything you needed. Marcus stood in their apartment's doorway, watching his mother adjust her new business suit. 1 week since Christmas, and already everything had changed. How do I look? She asked, smoothing invisible wrinkles. The suit was navy blue, crisp and professional, another gift from Mrs. Thompson that his mother had tried to refuse. Like a boss, Marcus said. Her answering smile lit up the room. The radiator hummed steadily behind him, pushing out real warmth. No more huddling under blankets, no more seeing their breath in the morning. The workers had finished most of the repairs 2 days after Christmas, transforming not just their apartment but the entire building. Mr. Patterson hadn't shown his face since. Mrs. Thompson's driver will be here in 10 minutes, his mother said, checking her phone, also new, part of her job package. You're sure you'll be okay alone? Mom, I'm 13. And it's just till 3, when I start at Mrs. Thompson's. She paused in gathering her papers. About that. Are you sure you want to work? You don't have to dash. I want to. Marcus touched the garden tools Mrs. Thompson had sent over yesterday. Proper ones, heavy and solid. Dad would have loved this job. His mother's eyes softened. Yes, he would have. A quiet knock interrupted them. Marcus opened the door to find Sarah, Mrs. Thompson's maid, holding a paper bag. Morning. She thrust the bag at him. Mrs. Thompson sent breakfast. Said neither of you should start new jobs on empty stomachs. The smell of fresh pastries filled the apartment. Marcus's mother tried to protest, but Sarah was already gone, her footsteps quick on the newly carpeted stairs. That woman, his mother sighed, but she was smiling as she peeked in the bag. Oh, still warm. They ate standing up, careful not to drop crumbs on their new clothes. Through the sealed windows, Marcus watched the street come alive. The local kids played in leftover snow, their laughter muffled but clear. Parents hurried to work, no longer hunched against drafty halls and broken heaters. "You've got your key?" his mother asked around a mouthful of pastry. "Phone charged? Money for lunch?" "Mom!" Marcus grinned. "I'm fine. Go be awesome at your new job." She pulled him into a tight hug, smelling of coffee and new perfume. "I love you so much, baby. Your father would be so proud." A car horn interrupted her. Through the window, Marcus saw the sleek company car waiting. "Go," he said, pushing her gently toward the door. "You'll be late." She grabbed a bag, then paused. "Maybe I should call Mrs. Thompson. See if you can start tomorrow instead." "Mom." Okay. She kissed his forehead. 3 o'clock sharp at Mrs. Thompson's. "Call if you need anything. Love you." Then she was gone, her heels clicking confidently on the stairs. Marcus watched from the window as the driver opened her door, just like in the movies. His mother, in her perfect suit, sliding into the back seat like she'd done it a million times. The apartment felt strange without her. Quiet, but a different kind of quiet than before. Not the heavy silence of worry and unpaid bills, but something lighter, peaceful. Marcus moved through the rooms slowly, touching the improvements. New weather stripping around the windows. Fresh paint covering old water stains. The bathroom sink that finally drained properly. In his room, he picked up the garden book Mrs. Thompson had sent, Basic Landscaping for Beginners. He'd stayed up late reading it, learning about soil types and pruning techniques. On his desk lay sketches for the spring gardens, carefully drawn with the new pencil sheet included. His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Thompson. "Cookie tasting at 3:30. Need expert opinion on which ones to serve at hospital board meeting." Marcus grinned. She'd been doing this all week, finding little ways to make the job feel less like charity. Yesterday it was testing new garden gloves. Before that, rating different hot chocolate recipes. He typed back, "Tough job, but someone's got to do it." Her response came quickly. "Indeed. Heavy burden, being a cookie expert. Sure you're up for it. I'll do my best. For the good of the hospital board. Brave boy. See you at 3. Marcus put the phone down, still smiling. He had 4 hours to kill before work. The apartment was clean, homework done, no papers to sell. Free time. He'd almost forgotten what that felt like. His eyes fell on his father's old toolbox, tucked in the corner. Inside lay the basic repair kit his dad had started teaching him to use before the accident. Marcus opened it carefully, running his fingers over the worn handles. A memory hit him, his father showing him how to fix a leaky faucet, those big hands guiding his smaller ones. "Always leave things better than you found them, son. That's what being good means." Marcus grabbed the toolbox and headed for the hall. Mrs. Rodriguez in 3B had mentioned a sticky door. Mr. Chen in 2A needed help hanging pictures in his kid's room. Small things, but his father would have helped. He knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door first. She opened it, surprise crossing her face. "Marcus, everything okay?" He held up the toolbox. "Heard your door was giving you trouble. Mind if I take a look?" Her expression softened. "Just like your papa, aren't you? Always helping." "Yes." Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest. That's kind of the point. He spent the morning moving from apartment to apartment, fixing what he could, making notes about what needed professionals. The residents tried to pay him, but he refused. Just being neighborly, he'd say, like his father used to. By 2 o'clock, his hands were dirty but his heart was full. He'd helped 6 families with small repairs, played with 3 dogs, and eaten enough thank-you cookies to rival Mrs. Thompson's afternoon tasting. Back in their apartment, he washed up and changed for work. The garden clothes Mrs. Thompson had sent were way nicer than anything he'd have picked. Heavy canvas pants, thick flannel shirt, boots that would actually keep his feet dry. His phone buzzed again. A picture from his mother, her new office, with a window view of the city. "Living the dream, baby. How's your morning?" Marcus sent back a photo of his dirty hands in the toolbox. Living Dad's dream. Making things better. Her response was just a heart, but he knew she was crying happy tears in her fancy new office. At 2:45, he headed out. The streets looked different now, not just because of the repairs and improvements spreading through the neighborhood, but because he saw them through new eyes. Not a kid selling papers in the cold, but someone with purpose. Someone who could help. He thought about Mrs. Thompson's words on Christmas morning, about seeing people, really seeing them. about how one act of kindness could change everything. His father had seen people, had helped them, even in a storm, and now Marcus understood, really understood. Why? Because sometimes being good wasn't just all you had. Sometimes it was a key that opened doors you never knew existed. Sometimes it was a light that showed you who you were meant to be. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it was the thread that stitched broken pieces back together, making something new and strong and beautiful. Marcus walked toward Mrs. Thompson's house, toolbox in one hand, garden book in the other. Ready to help, ready to learn, ready to make his father proud. 1 month after the Christmas storm, Marcus stood in Mrs. Thompson's garden, watching another snowfall begin. The flakes were gentle this time, drifting down like feathers in the late afternoon light. Hot chocolate break, Mrs. Thompson called from the porch. Before we both freeze. Marcus grinned, setting down his rake. They'd spent the afternoon clearing dead branches, preparing the garden for spring. His muscles ached, but in a good way. Coming. He pulled off his work gloves, proper ones now, thick leather that actually kept his hands warm. The kitchen smelled like chocolate and cinnamon. Sarah had the day off, but somehow Mrs. Thompson's hot chocolate was even better. She never made it the same way twice, always experimenting. Try this one, she said, sliding a mug across the counter. Added a pinch of cayenne. Marcus took a careful sip. Whoa, too spicy. No, it's perfect. Like drinking a warm hug. Mrs. Thompson laughed, a real laugh, not the polite one she'd used when he first met her. She did that more often now, especially when his mother joined them for Sunday dinners. Speaking of warm, she said, how's the building? Any complaints about the new heating system? Marcus shook his head. Everyone's good. Mr. Chen says his kids finally stopped wearing coats to bed. Something flickered across Mrs. Thompson's face. I should have known sooner. All those families, freezing in my own building. Hey, Marcus touched her hand. You fixed it as soon as you knew. That's what matters. She squeezed his fingers. You sound like James. Have you heard from him? Actually, yes. She pulled out her phone, showing him a text. He's coming to visit next week. Says he misses the garden. Marcus tried to hide his nervousness. He'd heard so much about James, seen his picture on Mrs. Thompson's wall. The successful son who'd moved across the country, who never called, who'd stopped helping in the garden. Marcus. Mrs. Thompson's voice was gentle. He's not replacing you. The garden's big enough for 2 helpers. If he wants to help. Oh, he does. She smiled. I told him about you. You know. About the storm. He said. He said it reminded him of who he used to be. Before Stanford, before his father's rules. Just a boy who loved making things grow. Outside, the snow fell harder. Marcus watched it cover his rake, erasing the day's work. Storm's picking up, he said. Mrs. Thompson followed his gaze. Reminds me of that night. I was so scared when I first saw you. You know, a strange boy in the snow. And I was scared you wouldn't let me help. Funny how fear works. She sipped her chocolate. Makes us miss the good right in front of us. Marcus's phone buzzed. His mother, sending a photo from work. She stood with a group of nurses, all smiling. The caption read, just approved new safety equipment for pediatrics. Think Dad would be proud. He would, Marcus whispered. Your mother's doing amazing things, Mrs. Thompson said, reading over his shoulder. The hospital board can't stop talking about her improvements to staff working conditions. She always wanted to help people. Just never had the chance before. A car door slammed outside. They both turned to see an elderly woman hurrying through the snow, carrying grocery bags. Marcus was moving before he thought about it. He grabbed his coat, running out into the storm. Let me help with those. The woman turned, startled. Then she smiled. Oh, thank you, dear. These old hands aren't what they used to be. Marcus took her bags, heavy with cans and produce. Where to? Just there. She pointed to the house next door. I'm Martha Wilson. Just moved in last week. I'm Marcus. I work in Mrs. Thompson's garden. Oh. Recognition lit her face. You're the boy from the Christmas storm. Eleanor told me about you. Heat crept up Marcus's neck. She exaggerates. I don't think so. Martha patted his arm as he set her groceries on her porch. We need more young people like you. More helpers. From Mrs. Thompson's kitchen window came the sound of laughter. Marcus looked back to see her watching them, something proud in her expression. "Would you like to come in?" Martha asked. "I just baked cookies. Too many for one old woman." Marcus glanced at the falling snow, then at his phone. Still 2 hours before he needed to head home. "Yes, I'd like that." Inside, Martha's house was warm and cluttered with moving boxes. She hadn't finished unpacking, he noticed. Some boxes looked too heavy for her to lift alone. "My children wanted me in a retirement home," she said, setting out cookies and milk. "But I'm not ready for that. Eleanor, Mrs. Thompson, she told me about this neighborhood, about the changes happening here. The community." Marcus thought about his morning, helping Mr. Chen hang pictures. About Mrs. Rodriguez bringing him lunch while he fixed her cabinets. About the way neighbors checked on each other now, sharing food and time and help. "It's a good place," he said. "Getting better all the time." Martha looked around her box-filled living room. "I don't suppose. I mean, if you have time, I can help unpack," Marcus offered. "Got my dad's toolbox at home, too. If you need anything hung up." Tears welled in her eyes. Just like Eleanor said, a helper, through and through. They spent the next hour unpacking boxes, Marcus lifting the heavy ones while Martha directed where things should go. She told him about her life, her late husband, her kids in California who were too busy to visit. Just like James, Marcus thought. His phone buzzed. "Mrs. Thompson, dinner's almost ready. Bring Martha. Sarah made enough for an army." Marcus showed Martha the text. "Would you like to? Mrs. Thompson's cook makes amazing lasagna." I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be." Marcus helped her with her coat. "That's not how things work here anymore." The snow had stopped by the time they walked next door. Through Mrs. Thompson's window, Marcus saw the table already set for 3. No, 4. She'd known he'd bring Martha. "Your father," Martha said suddenly. "Eleanor told me about him." "About the storm." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "He'd be proud, you know. Not just of the helping, but of the changes you've started. Sometimes it just takes one person, doing one good thing, to change everything," Marcus finished. "Yeah, I'm learning that." They climbed Mrs. Thompson's porch steps together, into the warm light spilling from her door. Inside, Marcus heard his mother's voice. She must have gotten off work early. "Welcome home," Mrs. Thompson called, appearing in the doorway. "Both of you?" And that's what it felt like, Marcus realized. Not work, not charity, not obligation. Home. A place where helping wasn't just something you did, but something you were. A place where being good wasn't just all you had. It was the key that opened every door. A place where one boy's choice to help in a storm could ripple out, touching life after life, until an entire community remembered how to be neighbors again. Marcus looked back at the snowy street, at the warm windows of homes he'd helped fix, at the gardens waiting for spring. His father would be proud. But more than that, Marcus was proud. Not of himself, but of what happens when people choose to be good, choose to help, choose to see each other. One small choice, one act of kindness, one storm that changed everything. And in the end, that was all it took to make a broken world whole again.